Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD. Today, I'm really excited to dive into Nelio Biedermann's LAZAR. I keep saying LAZAR because I, back in the day, did some gymnastics with a girl named Jamie LAZAR. I did look up how you pronounce all of these names, and it's very interesting when we start looking at the very beginning of the book. There's some real gems in terms of what these Hungarian names mean. In Hungarian, you say Lazar, but I'm just going to go ahead with Lazar. I think that's probably how most people in the United States are pronouncing it. The idea of many people pronouncing it is a good segue into this question of why am I reading this book now? Why am I sitting down to talk to you about it? This is a book that's causing a gigantic stir. So there are many books that cause a gigantic stir and they're not that interesting to me. This one is interesting, partially because of this notion of like this wunderkind. Nelio Biedermann is 23 years old. He's Swiss. He is writing about his Hungarian ancestors. He's writing in German. A lot of people calling him German. They're calling him Hungarian. I mean, these are like people not in the press, but these are just people, that I have spoken with. They're like, isn't he German? And I'm like, no, he's Swiss, which, for some people in the United States is kind of a fine distinction. But a lot is being made of the fact that he is so very young. He started writing about his family in like creative kind of fiction stuff during lockdown when he was like 16 years old. So he is very, very young. And this is absolutely a gigantic accomplishment. But whenever I hear about a book being really pushed because the writer is so young, I have my suspicions. And what I will say here, it's not a spoiler alert here in terms of any kind of plot, but it is a spoiler in terms of my attitude about the book. I wouldn't ever bring a book on here that I was just going to absolutely pan. There is so much working, and it's really interesting to look at what it is, too, that people are pulling out. If you can hear that moaning and groaning, that is one of my dogs who's over here rolling around. What we're going to do today is actually spend most of the time looking at what is working well, because one of the things I'm always trying to do when a book is such a sensation is understand what it is about the book that makes it so appealing. This is a book that spent 29 weeks on the German bestseller list, and we're going to get in a second to this question of like the appeal of a book like this in Germany, given the history of Germany, versus the appeal of it in the United States versus the history of the 20th century in the United States. But it's been so interesting to pull together this lecture about what is working and then to figure out why it was that over the course of the book, this is a book that kind of like as I was reading it through, it got less compelling. And it's really interesting to look at what it is about the book that is making that so. I'll just go ahead and dive in. One of the things that people are really enjoying is this kind of fairy tale aspect of it. Biedermann himself said in the very beginning, he was writing about his Hungarian, I think it's his father's family are Hungarian. They were Hungarian aristocrats, which is part of the problem. It's a little difficult sometimes to really, really empathize or sympathize with like a fallen aristocrat. It's a little hard to drum up a ton of sympathy for someone during the Holocaust if their big tragedy is that they're losing their manor house. I think I'm tipping my hand here and you're getting a bit of a sense of why it was frustrating. And in fact, that's one of the major frustrations. I found it a bit difficult to really sympathize with these people in this very kind of macro way, but also in some of the structural ways and in terms of how the characters are being developed. So we're going to dig into that. But people really are enjoying this idea, this kind of like fairy tale aspect of it. And people are really enjoying the sort of sweep of it. A lot is being made that this is kind of like this old fashioned novel and that is very appealing given the fact that in recent decades, we've seen lots of like this very, they call it dry autofiction, these kind of husks of books. I think that was one of the quotations about autofiction. I believe it's Joyce Carol Oates who was calling these books dry husks. As all of you know, love autofiction. I love these books that are much more stripped down and feel much more kind of real and compelling to me than this kind of like very, very, grand, multi-generational saga. And certainly a multi-generational saga that has fairy tale elements. I really liked them, but I do not find it quite as compelling as some of the more grounded work that we find in autofiction. With that being said, I am not someone, I can get really swept up in a really grand and very kind of rococo fairy tale thing. And there were aspects of this that really did draw me in. But I do think some of the hype is kind of overselling this fairy tale aspect. I also, as you can imagine, I get very hung up on people calling things magical realism when it is not, in fact, magical realism. And we're going to discuss the difference between this kind of fantasy, kind of fairy tale, like these tinges of fairy tale versus magical realism. It's a distinction that probably no one cares about as much as I do, but it is a very interesting one in terms of what is happening in like the context and in the scope of the novel. So I want to touch very quickly on a couple of things. One is that in the United States, so much is being made of this, like the youth of this author, and I imagine it is also in Europe certainly. But like this is like this. I think we have, you know, in the United States we have like this very like cult of youth thing, and we're always very impressed when people can do things at very young ages. And on the cover here we have Patti Smith saying that the book is an exquisite and masterly pronouncement that a gifted young writer walks among us, which is like kind of a big, you know, big thing to say. And then on the back by Daniel Kellman, we have a truly great writer steps onto the stage in full possession of his powers. And all of the press that it's getting, it's like all about Nelio Biedermann. They have these photographs of him and he looks like he's still 16 years old. If you're on the YouTube, I'll pop up some pictures of him. He has like one of those mustaches like that are very in vogue right now that I just am like, I don't understand a world where he's not going to look back and be like, oh my God, what was I thinking with that mustache? But this cult of youth is kind of like a lot of what people in the United States are drawn by. And I'm really fascinated with this question of like how this was received in Europe versus how it is received in the United States. There was something in the Wall Street Journal that was so interesting to me. I'm not generally a reader of the Wall Street Journal, but sometimes they have very good literary reviews. But the point that they were making is that the 20th century novel in the United States was all about rags to riches. It was all about rising up. It's all about, you know, progress. It's all about kind of like, you know, like our ascension as Americans, like individuals, as American individuals. Whereas the story of the novel in the 20th century in Europe is all about decline. It's about the fall of the aristocracy. It's about world wars. It's about, you know, things being stripped away, about rationing, about exile. So you have two like very different centuries that are seen in two very different places. And it's interesting to see how this book is being taken in those two countries. It spent 29 weeks on the German bestseller list. And I read another interesting thing. This was in the New York Times. On the YouTube, I'll post both of these. The review in the New York Times was quoting a German theorist called Adam Sobozinski, really not thinking that I am pronouncing that quite right. But he made the point that the novel has been very popular in Germany, in part because so many families, for lots of different reasons, were either shattered or incriminated. Those are the words that Adam was using. I'm avoiding his last name because I'm not sure that I could do it justice. That families are shattered or incriminated by the war. So this idea of seeing that experience in literature would be very affirming for people. He also makes the point that a lot of this kind of turmoil and a lot of what's happening in this novel is going to be somewhat similar, is going to have its parallels with what is happening in the 21st century in Europe. So you have this sense of like really important political reasons why this book would succeed in Europe. And I think in the United States, we are able, because we are incredibly fortunate, we're able to view it through kind of like a lighter lens, and we're able to focus on the youth of the author, and we're able to focus on the literary elements more so than what this book is saying about the deprivation and the difficulty of, you know, the overthrow of governments and the Holocaust and Stalinism and these very, very large, really destructive movements that were happening in the 20th century in those countries. So for those of you who like an agenda, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what is going well. And those things are the narrative stance, this fairy tale feel. We're going to talk about some kind of like gorgeous, kind of unexpected prose. Nelio Biedermann, I mean, I was kind of, I was airing some of my doubts about sort of the larger aspects of the novel, but there's no question that this guy can write incredibly well. It's very alluring prose, and it really does actually feel like prose that is written by someone who is older. Which I don't even know why I'm weighing in about youth. I'm not sure that like there's like a whole thing about like being able to write more ornately and more like beautifully when you're older. But we're going to take a look at why the prose is so gorgeous. We're then going to talk about three aspects where things are both going very well and then later not going quite as well. One is the use of history, the actual like historical events and how they are treated in the novel. Again, that's something that begins very strongly. And then as it moves on, I found myself less and less compelled by the way that actual history was woven in. Same thing goes actually for any kind of literary references. At the beginning, we have Hoffmann. Hoffmann was like, he was a German, I believe German. I'm making some assumptions just based on his last name. But he was someone who wrote like sort of like a Grimm's kind of fairy tale feel. I have a large coffee table book that is Maurice Sendak having illustrated all of those. And it's one of those Maurice Sendak ones, you know, he wrote Where the Wild Things Are, and he's just like an incredible favorite of mine. But wow, is there some darkness. I mean, as I'm looking through now, it is making sense to me that that Hoffmann, would be someone who, like, the insane uncle is reading, in early on in the book. Like, Hoffmann really like casts a shadow of this kind of crazy fairy tale thing. But again, that literature, the Hoffmann thing felt very good in the beginning. And as we go on, the literary references for me became somewhat less successful. Same goes for the structure. In the beginning, I was really enjoying the structure. Pacing is very quick. We're moving through time well. We have a good balance in the beginning, I think, of scenes where we're seeing things very in a very granular way, lots of detail, lots of color, good characterization. And then as things are moving on, the pacing gets to be such that we're skipping a little bit too much. We're moving too quickly from scene to scene or from generation to generation. We jump big chunks of years. And in the beginning, that feels gratifying, but it gets to feel a little bit like we're kind of skating through all of these generations and we can't really kind of get hold of things, to mix a metaphor. We're then going to go through a quick list of what is not working so well. And I'm just going to give it to you right now. I'm going to do the list of things that are not working very well. And then we're going to dive into taking a closer look at these aspects of things that are working really well. So the main thing that's not working well for me is something I mentioned, which is this idea of having like lots of sympathy for fallen aristocracy. So I think that there's a way that I could have felt more sympathy for someone who is an aristocrat. I mean, frankly, like there are lots of aristocrats in history where I have read about them and have had sympathy, when they have been sent to the guillotine. But the problem here is that it's always going to be an uphill battle, and you're going to have to really demonstrate by like really making me care about the person and their plight and the injustice or the violence of what is going to happen to them. This group of aristocrats from the start is not a group of people that I liked. I am absolutely not someone who has to like characters in order to really like engage with them or even sympathize with them. But this was like, it felt a little unrelenting in terms of like the unlikability of these people. So right from the start, we have, the birth of this child. And within pages, we realize that the mother is unhappy, that the father is not the father of the child. The book is rife with infidelity, which again is fine. I don't have a problem, with, it's not like I'm morally judging people for infidelity, but we don't really learn a lot about like what is drawing these people to one another or why they are drawn away from the people that they're actually married to. And there's tons of infidelity. There's also a lot of rape all throughout the book. And it's treated, I think, sometimes in ways that feels a little light. It's just like there's a lot of it. And some of it felt kind of gratuitous. Like I just was a little bit like, I mean, it would be a stretch to think that this is any kind of like a metaphor or a motif, I think, that is worth really digging into. And right from the beginning, and this kind of goes hand in hand with all of the infidelity and the rape, is this idea of shame. All of these people from the beginning are rife with shame. They are just like despairing people. There's kind of, the crazy brother who becomes the crazy uncle. Even the children in the beginning of the book have these kind of eerie, and again, like I like eerie's fine with me, but if all we're getting is kind of eerie shame and despair, it's a little difficult to really like love these people. And then as we move on, the stakes actually get higher because it's one thing to just like, be like amongst your family and like not behaving well within, the walls of your, frankly, like of your manor house / castle. That is one thing. It's another to have like the main character. Well, I mean, honestly, at one point he's a fan of Hitler. That was a moment where I was like, I'm going to have a hard time coming back from this. And he was already a character who was very slippery, someone I couldn't quite get a handle on. I wanted to like him when he is born with his transparent skin. We have the sense that we should be sympathizing with him. And yet he is someone who we don't really, I feel, get to know very well. He's kind of an inconsistent character. He has sort of this young love. He has this marriage, none of which is really very very fulfilling. We have a rape scene where he is raped by peers with a candle, which, I mean, it's not very graphic, but it's really, it's like a very big, it ends the chapter. It's like a very big kind of thing to sort of lob in there. And then we don't get a lot of a sense of like how it is. I mean, I'm not even asking for these things to be like super, I don't need to like have some big development about, like how that rape is affecting him. But I do have this sense of like, how are we meant to piece all of this together? So that character, who really is in many ways like our mainstay and our kind of like the through line of the book, is someone who is sympathetic to Hitler. A little bit tough to come back from that. He's also someone who just makes kind of a half-hearted attempt, like, I mean, I'm not even sure you could call it half-hearted. He makes a lame attempt when he realizes that the Jewish people around him are being literally shipped to concentration camps. He's not doing what we would want him to do. And we don't even have a good explanation for why he is not. I can understand that maybe you could convince me that someone is not sympathetic or not helpful because they were so concerned about their family or themselves or whatever. We don't get a lot of sense of why it is that this is happening, why it is that he is, drawn to Hitler, and then why it is that he is not helping the people around him once he is, not such a fan of the Fuhrer. And then there's just this kind of like basic thing about like the big tragedy for them is that they're losing their fortune. So it's an interesting problem because Nelio Biedermann is writing about his father's family. And he talked about how one of the things that was very helpful for him was this idea of having there be these kind of fairy tale like overtones and feelings, because when he was trying to write a very like straightforward, more like historical fiction kind of novel, it was difficult for him to kind of do justice to his family or to really make his family compelling. So you get the sense that Nelio Biedermann is like trying to tell a story about his family that's fairly true to form. There's a really great thing in one of the interviews where he talked to his dad on the phone after just when, I think he like shipped the manuscript to his family. They'd never read it before. And when his father read it, he called him and said, "This isn't anything like our family." And then he called him back a little later and was like, "Wait, this is exactly like our family." And I love that idea that like Nelio Biedermann was able to kind of stretch it a little bit. And I like the idea of not trying to just write like a very straightforward historical fiction thing. But one of the problems is that if you're trying to kind of follow along with the actual, like what happened in terms of like broad strokes, in terms of like who was killed or who was able to exile themselves in the United States, who was able to, stay at the manor house, who committed suicide, who was raped. I mean, I have no idea how like really close to the family story he stayed, but you get the feeling that in the broader strokes, it's kind of a non-tragic story about this family. I'm not going to spoil things, but like it's not, it felt like sort of mundane, which is fine. And I think you could find a lot that is compelling and fascinating in the mundane. But if the mundane tragedy is that you are being kicked out of your gigantic manor house and, you have to go live in a smaller house, and that's, I'm exaggerating this a little bit. It is tragic what happens to them, and they are certainly displaced. But again, it's very difficult on some level to like really sympathize. I literally, on page 192, at the bottom it says Crimea River. Like I just was like, I don't know. I'm just having a hard time like really sympathizing with these people whose like, jewels are being taken from them. And the last thing I want to say about the stuff that's not working before we dive into what is really working very well is they're kind of like more like literary types of things, not so much to do with the actual story. One, I mentioned this before, the pacing, in the beginning, it feels very good. And then what happens is it starts to become really repetitive. There's like a thing where we know from each story of a marriage or each story of like a coming of age, we have these scenes that are really striking. And then we'll skip ahead, 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. And we're kind of in the next scene. And the problem with that kind of pacing, if it continues over the course of 260 pages, the book's 258. If it continues over that span and you don't have more kind of texture, it's like you're getting these scenes, but they all feel kind of disparate and they're not coming together quite the right way. And you also have this idea of kind of like repetition. It got to feel a little repetitive. And yes, you could argue that like generation to generation, there is meant to be this kind of repetition because we are unable to, escape from our circumstances and our family and our genetics. Like there is something there that is actually interesting. But when it becomes so predictable in terms of the pace, you're like, okay, well, we're going to see another marriage, and then we're going to see someone be unfaithful. And then we're going to see a really interesting part where Lajos is going to go and see, a psychiatrist, and that's going to be interesting. I mean, there are these chunks that are very interesting. The other thing that starts happening, though, especially once we're getting into a more modern era and things are becoming identifiable, like the presence of Freud and Freudian analysts, is you do get the sense that he's like, okay, now I need to talk about Freud and the analysts because we're in Vienna. So you have the scene, and then you jump 3 years to the next thing. So there's a sense of like predictability to the whole thing that starts to wear, because if something feels predictable and then it switches, then it's not predictable anymore. You kind of lulled into a sense of security, and then something shifts and it's interesting. This to me felt like it was predictable, and it ended up being predictable in terms of the pacing. Partially because of that, the problems with the structure, I found the characters a little shadowy. So we have this mother figure in the beginning. She is someone who always felt to me like she was at arm's length. It's like everyone in the book is a little at arm's length, even the ones we were following very closely. There were some inconsistencies with Lajos that were so, like, I was like, what? And like, when a character does something that's unexpected, often that's a very good thing. Sometimes it's a sign that they're changing. But when you're like, that doesn't really fit with my vision or my feeling of that character, then it's a problem that your author should have done a better job with. I just was kind of like, wait, is this the same character who was born with a transparent skin? So there were some inconsistencies that just didn't hang together for me. My other kind of larger issue is that there didn't feel to me like a through line. We didn't have a sense of tension. We do have the one character who sort of moves us through, but he is someone who I just described him as kind of slippery and inconsistent. We also, again, because he's an aristocrat, I'm kind of like, what's the big tension here? We're going to have a family. The aristocracy is going to fall. There are lots of different ways that we are seeing that foretold. And then you're like, okay, they're either going to be in exile, or they are going to, move and live in a smaller, reduced circumstance, or maybe they're going to be shot. It's like any one of those could be really interesting, but for some reason it feels like it just kind of dissipates. I didn't feel any time, I wasn't like, oh no, what is going to happen with Bertha? Or oh no, what is going to happen with Matilda? Or I just felt like we didn't have enough of a sense of urgency or tension. There wasn't a question where we were like, what is going to happen here? It was like, okay, this is going to be a fairly predictable, story of a large family who is going to meet different fates. But I didn't feel particularly invested in any of them. So all of that sounds like very negative, and I'm not wild about the negativity here, but I also feel like I need to be honest. Especially a lot of the reviews, which I read after I finished and had made my notes, there was one that was like, no one should ever publish anything before they turn 30, and that was something that Virginia Woolf said, and I was like, honestly, hallelujah. Everyone is talking about, I mean, not everyone, but the reviews that I think were honest, and even the ones that were very positive, kind of hinted at this. He is an incredible writer, but there's something about the story that ends up just falling a little flat, just not being quite as rewarding as it could be. This is just an absolute object lesson in this idea that it is not enough to be a good writer. I'm going to flatter myself right here. I mean, when I was writing novels, I wrote two novels that are not published, obviously. And I was definitely not like Nelio Biedermann. I was not as good a writer as he is. But because I'm not invested in plot as a reader, I just genuinely kind of don't care very much, I just couldn't plot anything. Literally the things that I wrote were just not interesting in terms of what's going to happen, or in terms of any kind of tension or plot. And I stopped writing because I realized it is not enough to be a good writer. You can write beautifully, but if you don't have something really compelling to say, and if you don't have a story that's pulling your reader along, it's not going to work. I mean, very famously, people are like, oh, in Virginia Woolf, nothing happens, so it's fine to write about nothing happening. I absolutely do not accept this weird idea that nothing happens in Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway, there's so much happening there. You have the whole story of Mrs. Dalloway. You have Septimus Smith. You have Lucretia. You have the party. And you have Peter Walsh. I mean, there is an enormous amount that is happening in that book. There is lots and lots of plot and tension. As soon as Septimus or Peter is introduced at the top, you're like, oh, if you're a sensitive reader, you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen to this poor poor Italian woman who's married to this shell-shocked British guy. Like there's an enormous amount of tension in those books. Even to The Lighthouse, where, I would argue that kind of less happens there. But there's the whole thing with Paul and Minta Doyle. There's lots of tension about the different girls, meaning like Prue, and you have this question of like Cam and like youth, and you're flashing forward and you're flashing back, and you want to know about the marriage and Mr. Ramsey. Like, yes, there's a question of, are they going to arrive at the lighthouse? But like, what's going on with Lily Briscoe? Like, there is a huge amount happening in Virginia Woolf, and she's an incredibly beautiful writer. But the point here is you cannot just be a beautiful writer. The point also is I am not comparing myself to Nelio Biedermann, and I am 100% not even putting myself anywhere close to a conversation with Virginia Woolf. But I always kind of fancied myself. I'm like, oh, I'm just writing this beautiful book and nothing has to happen because nothing happens. That is back before I realized that something absolutely must happen. Okay, we're now going to dive into the book itself. We're going to just begin with the title. LAZAR is really interesting because it's a common name in Hungary, but it is a variant of Lazarus. So I love the sort of poetic thing they're talking about, this idea of coming back from the dead kind of a thing. It's very artful. It's very interesting. It's a very big idea to name your book after Lazarus, and certainly in like a multi-generational like saga like this, it's very interesting to think about bringing someone back from the dead. It's interesting just in terms of any historical fiction. 23-year-old, I mean, he must have been like 21 when he finished writing this thing. Like this idea of resurrection is really interesting, and I like the kind of like huge like biblical overtones. I do also like the idea of putting the family name there. It's really reminding us that we are meant to focus on this group of people, but also on the broad sweep of it, not on any one character. It's dedicated to his family, seems predictable and good. We have a table of contents, which I like when it feels meaningful, and this one did. So in this table of contents here, we have the glass child, then we have ghosts, dreams, and shadows, then we have voices, and then at the end, the siblings. I'm looking at it on the page here, and it's all center justified, so it's like all in a column. But the glass child and the siblings are, because they're longer and they have a definite article there, they stand out a little longer. So in my mind, I felt like those were kind of bookends in some way. And also, they're bookends in the sense that you have the glass child and then you have the sibling. You have the notion of like humans like being represented there, specific ones. And then everything in the middle, ghost, dream, shadows, voices, those are all things that are kind of hard to get a hold of. So I looked at this and I was like, wow, guys, this is going to be good. Like, to me, this had a huge amount of like potential. I was very interested in how all of these like ghostly, shadowy, like dreamy voices, I'm like, wow, like this is really going to be something. And I have to say, as you know, ended up being a tiny bit disappointing. We then have an epigraph here. A blonde poet perhaps goes mad. So this is by someone named Alfred Lichtenstein. He was born in 1889. He's a German poet, a romantic poet. He died in 1914 when he was 25 years old, and he was fighting in World War I. And I was interested in that in the sense that like this is someone in his youth who was like, a pretty important poet. We're still reading him today, but he was like struck down in his youth. And part of me was like, it's interesting that someone who's so young is choosing someone who was, one of these kind of wunderkinds. I read the poem itself, and it's a list. He's an expressionist poet. I learned all that from the Poetry Foundation. This is not, I don't have like German poets, German romantic poets, just like top of mind. But he's an expressionist poet, so he has it's like feels very kind of modern, actually. This is around the turn of the century. You're about to head into modernism with people like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. So we're kind of on the verge of that. And it's a list of like, it's not this thing, but like a pebble falls in a puddle, like that kind of thing. And then a blonde poet perhaps goes mad. When I read blonde, I was like, uh-oh, like we're talking like, I mean, this is such a bad thing. But like whenever someone makes a point of someone being blonde, I immediately go to like an Aryan thing. Like I'm immediately suspicious of that person. The idea of blonde, people in the 20th century, there is a sense of like this like weird hierarchy that was put in place, frankly, by the Nazis, which is like, I mean, I'm like kind of going out on a limb here, but honestly, when like the blonde thing, I mean, I actually am kind of blonde, used to be blonde, still trying to be blonde in a weird way. I just thought it was interesting, the epigraph. And for me, because then we do have like someone who is sympathetic to Hitler, although he then changes his mind, there was part of me that's like, why are we talking about a blonde poet in the very beginning here? I think Nelio Biedermann, I mean, he's one of these people, to me, he looks kind of blonde, but I think you could also say that his hair is light brown. Like one of these, he certainly, I think, would have been blonde when he was little. But so I'm a little like, is he talking about himself? Like this was a little inscrutable to me, and I did some thinking on it, clearly, and it still remains a bit inscrutable. We then have the section title, which is The Glass Child. We're now going to dive into just like the absolutely gorgeous prose in the opening of this novel. Oh my God, I'm having a hard time wrangling my glasses there. Okay, on page 3. The snow of the dying centuries still lay on the edge of the dark forest when Lajos von LAZAR, the translucent child with water-blue eyes, first glimpsed the man he would believe to be his father for his whole life and beyond. It was the evening of Epiphany. The forest swallowed the last of the murky blue light. The room where the child was born lay in the western wing of the manor house, right next to the one painted blue, which nobody ever entered. While the midwife washed the child's back, Sandor von LAZAR stood at the window scanning the forest. It was as if he had seen something vanish into the undergrowth. Then at the window, he has this feeling like a fissure is opening inside of him. It's anxiety, and then he realizes it's just a normal amount of panic. I'm skipping a little bit. He breathed a sigh of relief. He was not like his brother, nor like his mother, just slightly unsettled, which should come as no surprise given that his wife had just given birth to a baby whose tiny organs were visible beneath its transparent skin. So there is so much potential here. I mean, I find the writing so beautiful. The snow of the dying century still lay on the edge of, I found that very beautiful. One of the critics I read later was like, what is that? Like, what does that even mean? I found it very compelling. And it really does set this beautiful tone. So importantly, Lajos is, it's a version of Louis. So you have like Louis the 14th. So you have this idea of royalty as being really intact here. And then of course, this idea of Lazarus. And right from the beginning, we have this question of the transparent skin. I will say that really piqued my curiosity and kind of like nothing happened with it. It was not particularly important. And not only do we have this question of the transparent skin, but we have the question of paternity right from the beginning. And it's this kind of like really big statement here. The man he would believe to be his father for his whole life and beyond. It's a very big pronouncement. And it interestingly, we find out in a very cool way, actually, but very quickly we realize who his father is. So you have this sense of like creating this kind of tension that is dispelled in a satisfying way, but very quickly. We then introduce the dark forest. So for me, the like presence of the forest was the thing that gave it like the most kind of fairy tale feel. There were two things. One was the forest and one was sleeping. Everybody was sleeping a lot. At one point, Lajos's mother goes to sleep for 6 days. To me, that feels like, very like Sleeping Beauty kind of thing. And we have different like creatures that are coming in and out of the forest. But in many ways, that was kind of the extent of the fairy tale feel. It does, like, I think because of the manor houses and because there is a fairy tale quality to it, but it's not a book where we have like a really beautiful metaphor that follows along one of the Grimm's fairy tales, or we have the presence of like an ogre creature, not like an actual ogre creature, but someone who could be read into one of these like typical fairy tale kind of trope things. But in the beginning, I was like really interested here. So whenever you come across a house in literature, you should stop and you should think to yourself whether or not the writer, if they're worth their salt, whether or not the writer is allowing that house to show you like something about the people who live in it. This is this idea of house as metaphor. It's often very interesting. If the house is falling down and it's in disrepair and this, the like whatever roof tiles are missing, then that tells you something about the people who are living there. Same goes for a garden. This is a very like Shakespearean thing. If like the garden is unkempt and there are weeds and whatever nightshades, then that like is really saying something about the people who are keeping that garden. In this case, the houses do tell us something. The descriptions of the houses are somewhat detailed and they're kind of interesting. We have the very intriguing idea here that there's a room no one goes into, and that is another mystery that is solved very quickly. But we have this concept of the house as being somewhat interesting. You have the manor house, you have the house in Budapest, you have these different places. But I loved the idea of reading this forest as being kind of a stand-in for the garden. So instead of having like some beautiful grounds or the garden, everyone in this family is totally fixated on the forest. There are times when different members go into the forest and different, events happen as a result of that. one of which is kind of inscrutable. But this question about the forest is like really intense, and it's like seen as this kind of dark forest, and it's ominous and all sorts of things. Like it has the potential to have things happen, and that to me does give it a really beautiful sense of fairy tale. You also, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like the Black Forest in Germany. This is Hungary, so we're not having that, but you do have the idea of like these European forests that in this case it feels very ominous. I also looked up whether or not in German that like expression, you can't see the forest for the trees, if that expression here is the same in German, and it is exactly the same. So I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's the same. You would say he can't see the forest for the trees. And that expression, of course, is that like you're so mired in little details that you can't see the larger picture here. And I would argue, I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but the like notion of this forest is this kind of amorphous, like kind of generic, like really vast like threat that all of these people are kind of dealing with and facing at different points. And I like the idea of being not being able to see the detail of the thing, but being able to see kind of like the menace of the forest. But I would also say that this is one of those things that maybe doesn't get developed in quite the way that I might have wanted it to. I guess you could say that there are a bunch of different wars that occur, there are different revolutions, and the family is always a little bit surprised by them or sort of doesn't believe in them. There's that very interesting, cool thing in the beginning where the father is reading newspapers from the day, they're always a day late. So you get the feeling that the family, as a good aristocratic family will do, is kind of out of step with time and with history and with threats. So I liked the beginning about how we were setting up these kinds of motifs, like the threat of the forest and not being able to see the details because you're seeing the news a day late. All of that felt very, it was like very good potential in my mind. I want to move on now and talk about the narrative stance. In any good fairy tale, you're going to have an omniscient narrator, that like kind of once upon a time kind of thing. You have the idea of like a narrator that's very far pulled back and that's telling a story where they know the whole story and they're going to give you kind of, a very curated look at it. And some of it's going to be like big sweeping things, and some of it's going to be like, there was a princess who lived in a castle. And we do have here, it's like a pretty stock, like omniscient narrator at the beginning. What I really like about it is this narrator is then doing all kinds of things. I mean, not all kinds of things, but you have the omniscient narrator who then moves into a limited third, which we're going to take a look at. And at times it takes on the voice, which we're also going to look at. The narrator is really great. In one of the reviews I read, they were talking about how kind of like nimble the prose is and how like the tense will change in the middle of a paragraph. I actually did, that happened one time and I was keeping track of it because it happened at a really important point. And I was like, maybe he's going to use a lot of present tense. I did not actually find a lot of that happening throughout. What I found, which I think maybe this person was also picking up on, there's a lot of anachronism that I actually think is working very well. And when I say anachronism, I don't mean that like, there's a cell phone in like the beginning of the 20th century. What I mean is that we have phrasing that feels very like modern in many ways. And I like it when a writer who is writing from some point in the future uses language that for us is like, that feels very modern, because it does make it, I think, more accessible. It gives us points of entry. And these anachronisms, to be fair, were very subtle. They were things that I was looking for and phrases that I was pulling out, and we'll look at them. Like you'll see, they're very, very subtle, but they do feel like phrases that are from the 21st century, not from the beginning of the 20th. So I want to look here right at the very first page. We're still on page 3. We have the idea of the Baron, looking out the window, and then the idea of the baby whose tiny organs were visible beneath its transparent skin. Then we have a space break, and we have this. The Baron ate dinner only in the company of his 6-year-old daughter, who was not at all happy about the birth of her brother. When Ida, the German nanny, had taken Alana to the room in the western wing, the girl had narrowed her brown eyes, looked very serious as she stared at this wrinkled, pale blue and bloated creature, and said dryly, "He's very ugly." So there are a couple of things that make this feel immediate, and they're very subtle. The idea of she stared at this wrinkled, pale blue, bloated creature. The idea of having this creature makes you feel like you're there. So a lot of the writing, the way that people were describing it in the reviews, it was very gratifying for me, because I had gone through and looked very carefully at the prose, because I was trying to figure out what actual like specific aspects were making it feel compelling and immediate in the beginning. And it's that kind of very subtle thing. It's like the story's in the past tense, but when we have, like, it should have been she was staring at the creature, but staring at this creature makes it feel like it's happening right now. Obviously, I need to interject here the fact that this is a translation from the German. I'm not sure, like, exactly how that would have read in German. And this is a real question, but, I do not have any German at all. So unfortunately, I can't look into that. And when I bump up against this problem, I just always have to say, like, okay, I'm dealing with the text I'm dealing with here. I'm not going to second guess this. And what's happening here, this is not actually technically like an actual limited third person or a close third person, because we still are pretty omniscient. We're just describing what this one character is doing, but we are moving closer to someone. It's not this kind of like more broad thing about the baby and the father and like the perspective from this like glass child and then the perspective of the father. We are kind of homing in a bit more on her own perceptions. And then on the very next page, like literally, 3 paragraphs later, we have this. Alana could tell that her father was still angry with her by the energetic way he was cutting up his red meat. She knew he could sense her eyes on him. He could tell at once when someone was looking at him, but she could not avert them from the thick, bushy mustache that danced over his chewing mouth. This is so good. I mean, like, this is like so well done. This is the kind of prose that I was really enchanted by. Like now I'm really leaning into the fairy tale thing. I was enchanted by this at the very beginning. And it's really interesting here because you have this idea like Alana could tell that her father was angry. Now we are moving more into the inside of this person. It makes the prose feel more immediate. It makes it feel more specific. It's a really good way to engage your reader. I also really love that we have an M dash, which I have to tell you that because you don't have it in front of you. We have an M dash, and then we have a clause that says he could tell at once when someone was looking at him. So we're shifting then into the like Sandor's point of view, and then we're shifting back to Alana. So this is a narrator that's very nimble, and that is a very good way to help the reader get to know people and also to be very sympathetic with these people. And I love the idea that like the specificity of the like the personification here of the mustache dancing above his chewing mouth. There's so much to be recommended here, and partially it's because of the narration, but also it's just like it's very detailed, really interesting prose. I want to look at one other chunk where we have where a narrator is entering into the mind of a character. It's the mother character, and I could not remember her name. And very like importantly, her name is Maria, which of course is a stand-in for Mary. Like we're getting very biblical here. We've got Lazarus, we've got Mary. But what we're looking at here is not so much her name, but the fact that this is a really like deft use of a narrator. Like this is the kind of writing that is kind of shocking to see this in a 23-year-old. It's a little bit unusual and it is very effective. So what we have here is Maria is thinking about Sandor and her husband, not the father of the child, but she's thinking about him and she's giving us some like important and accurate information about, we can presume it is accurate, you can question that, but about what is happening for him. We learn a bit more about him, but then we also move to give a bunch of her backstory. And when you're in the mind of someone and they're like thinking about their childhood, it can often feel very clumsy and kind of like stilted. And he does such a good job with it because this narrator is so deftly entering into her mind. So on page 34, Sandor left the bathroom and got dressed as he gazed out of the window. She knew he did this only to avoid having to look at her. He had no feeling for anything. For him, a tree was just a woody plant, a human being merely an intelligent animal, and a story nothing more than a fiction. In the past, around the time of their wedding, Maria had clung to this simplicity. Sandor and country life had given her a psychological stability that had been unthinkable in her parents' dilapidated villa and at the girls' boarding school. The social decline of her family and of Viennese society, with all its pretensions, codes, and rules, with its decadence and double morality, and the endless balls that were evenings in hell for Maria, had been too much of a burden for her. I found this so well done. So this is just really, this is a writer, definitely firing on all cylinders. And it is really impressive to me that someone who is so young is able to do this, because it's a bit, we're kind of violating some rules here a little in terms of like shifting around and giving exposition. And it could have been clunky, and it definitely is not. I want to take one last look at the section just to see how this narrative voice is working well. Longtime listeners know that the way that I kind of operate is as I'm reading through a book, if something seems like it's going to be significant or there's some kind of motif or there's an interesting narrative stance, there's always an interesting narrative stance. But like if there's something of note, if you're on the YouTube, I will show you. I'll have it in the back of the book, and then I will mark down page numbers where I see that thing repeating so I can go back and use the kind of most significant of them. And one of the little categories that I had here was an exclamation mark. I think that Nelio Biedermann is doing such good work with the exclamation mark, and he's using it in all sorts of different ways. What's interesting is a lot of the exclamation marks are not in dialogue. They are used by our narrator. And what that shows us is that the narrator is really adopting the voice of someone in a way that is really showing a lot about that person, which is a really, again, a very effective way to have your reader get to know someone. It can read too like a little bit kind of light and joyous and like kind of frivolous in a way that also I think kind of goes with the fairy tale thing. In my mind, there's like it's not a fantastic element, but a little bit. So on page 74, maybe just because it's an exaggeration. And for anyone who doesn't want a spoiler, you might want to just like zip forward like 30 seconds because this does give some incident. We are here on page 74. So we're like, whatever, a third into the book. As soon as they arrived, they had thrown open the shutters and fallen happily onto the double bed. She and Lajos in a room all of their own! ! She and Lajos and their love for each other, which would not have even fitted in the largest of their trunks. And this bed, heavenly, one bed for two of them, and no wall separating them any longer. It was unbelievable. So that is a whole series of sentences with these exclamation marks. And it's a very effective way for us to see the kind of enthusiasm in this character that she is feeling and that she is translating to us very effectively. It also is a little bit twee, of course. I mean, it's like a little bit kind of overdone, but that is very appropriate also given this character. We're going to move on from narrative voice to take a little closer look at this fairy tale element. We've spoken about it, but I just want to touch on a couple of things. And one of them, on the bottom of the very first page, we actually already read this, but I'm going to read it again quickly. And when I do, if you have fairy tale in mind, I think you can really see how this does feel very fairy tale-like. So this is number on the very first page after the space break. The Baron ate dinner only in the company of his 6-year-old daughter, who was not at all happy about the birth of her brother. We have Ida coming in, and Alana sees the baby. She looked very serious as she stared at this wrinkled, pale blue and bloated creature and said, dryly, "He's very ugly." So there's something there about, like, the Baron ate only with his 6-year-old daughter. That I think maybe we mean that one time because the baby has just been born. But there's kind of this, like, pronouncement and strangeness. It's a little uncanny. You picture, in my mind, it's kind of like a weird, like, Addams Family thing where we have Sandor at the end of the table and then we have, like, his 6-year-old daughter at the other end of the table or, like, right in the middle of some super long table. And then we get the sense that, like, this daughter has, like, some kind of, like, power when she's like, he's very ugly. And, like, you have this idea that, like, some ugly baby is born and someone's going to turn it into a pig or something. So I read this just to like give you a sense, especially like in all of the blurbs and when people are talking about, they're like, oh, it's this really old school novel. It feels very old fashioned and kind of fairy tale-y. It's very appealing. And when you have that lens, you can really start seeing it. I also mentioned that the idea of the forest is very fairy tale-y. There's also an idea of things being haunted, like of ghostly presences. And to me, that's more like a horror kind of gothic thing than it is a fairy tale. But you have that same kind of eerie, kind of uncanny thing. So on page 50, this is also a little spoiler. So if you have not read the book, just zip ahead like 30 seconds. It's right at the top of chapter 12. The Easter weeks of 1912 were the time of sleepless nights. I mean, even that, like earlier when it was the Epiphany and now it's Easter, I mean, the Epiphany is even more like kind of striking because of the like broader meaning of Epiphany. But here we have the Easter weeks were the time of sleepless nights. Like to me, that sounds very fairy tale-y. It's like they were the time of sleepless nights, for everyone. And then this is the spoiler. After Jonathan's murder, which without any investigation was blamed on the Roma living on the edge of town, Maria slept for 6 days on end without anybody being able to wake her, and she had been unable to sleep ever since. Although she lay in bed and closed her eyes, this was only to preserve the semblance of normality. And the last thing that I will say about this kind of fairy tale feel is that I really liked the aspect that when the kind of like historical world intruded, it was like a real shock to me. Like when we suddenly realized that we are in the 20th century, I'm like, oh my God, wait, we're in the beginning of the 20th century. So part of the fairy tale feel is that everything is very old fashioned. I mean, that seems very obvious, but like if you're, the Brothers Grimm and you are writing these fairy tales, you're casting back even further than whenever they were writing them. I don't actually know. That's interesting. But clearly, if you're talking about like a shack in the woods made out of twigs, like that is, hearkening back to a somewhat of a different era. And so one of the ways that I like identified that feeling of like kind of like the like fairy tale feel and like the old school feel is that suddenly when there's a car, which is what happens, like that's the first time that I was like, oh my God, wait. Also because it literally says 1912. But when we have like an indication that we are in like a more modern time, it was such a shock and it felt kind of out of place. And that to me is a sign that Nelio Biedermann has really like done a good job of establishing this as kind of like a surreal kind of fantasy-ish, old-fashioned fairy tale kind of vibe. There are also some kind of like weird things that happen that I actually also appreciated because they kind of carried this through. At one point, one of the characters is eating the love letters and he has this kind of strange taste in his mouth. And he like doesn't know where the letter has gone. And then he like suddenly realizes that he has eaten it and he continues to eat her letters. So when you have that kind of an oddity, like that was a little bit of a continuation. But like in my notes here, that's the only thing that I have that's in that kind of category, that sort of like uncanny, absurd, not totally impossible, but like not probable. What I think I would have liked is like either more or less of it. Also, things like there needed to be some significance. The transparent skin, I don't think we can really read that very convincingly as like that he is someone who's like really sensitive or something. There's not nothing really comes of that. And these tropes are best used, like the whole idea of the fairy tale is best used if it actually has some kind of significance. Like if you say, so what? Why is it like a fairy tale? Maybe you're talking about if fairy tales have castles, then it's the fall of the aristocracy. That to me is compelling, but I would have liked that to have been made like a bit more clear. So I mentioned before that we were going to take a look at just like some of the prose that is really gorgeous. And I think we've looked at some of that. I mean, again, I find the prose so compelling. So on page 9, we have a paragraph. What I liked about the prose is that some of it does feel very unexpected. And that continues throughout. I found it more kind of notable at the beginning. But I do want to take a look at a brief paragraph here, just because of like to look at how beautiful this prose is. This also, interestingly, is about Maria. We're at the beginning of the book, and this to me, Maria seemed like a pretty feminist character. Like she was someone who, I mean, things did not end well, so like maybe we are not reading this as a feminist novel, but she was someone who did what she wanted to do and certainly had a lot of agency, and was kind of unapologetic about it. But on page 9, we have her kind of outsmarting like our Sandor, like the patriarch, because he makes like a comment about the fact that the child looks nothing like him, and she very smartly says that he looks like one of Sandor's ancestors. So which is ingenious and smart, which is another reason why like this feels like a very strong woman. So on page 9 we have her voice, and then we have this beautiful paragraph. But of course, darling, how else would he look so much like Hayo the First? This was a bold answer, for there was neither a picture nor a description of the forefather of the LAZAR dynasty, who, at the age of 14, had followed the Danube to Budapest with nothing save for a blue-black raven on his shoulder and a hunk of hard bread in his bag, had trained to be a jeweler, fought in the siege of Shvetgar. That is not, I am certain, a good pronunciation here. Fought in the siege, surviving the battle thanks to his extraordinary cowardice, and then, to counter his innate solitude, had fathered 16 children. So I loved this, and I also, like, this is such a strong piece of writing, not only because the writing is beautiful, but because it's unexpected. Like, the idea that he succeeded because of his cowardice, it is so good. We're having a reversal of expectation. It's toward the end of the paragraph. We're, like, leading up to this, like, idea that he's going to be this amazing patriarch. I loved the economy here. It is very fairy tale-like. He's, like, walking along the river, and so you have this sense of him on a journey, a quest. He's got only the raven and the hunk of bread, the idea of like the animal familiar, the raven. You have this kind of fairy tale feel to the whole thing. And then not only do we have like the unexpected thing about the cowardice, but we have this idea of him fathering 16 children. It's genius. And I hope that Biedermann, like I hope this is a true like thing about his family, but it honestly doesn't, like I don't care at all whether or not this is factual because it is so good. Also, we have this idea that there is no image of him. So we have this sense of like the importance of a novel or the importance of any kind of written thing as giving us a sense of who these people were, because there are plenty of people in the, in any family, and certainly like in this aristocratic one, that somebody might want to have a sense of. And language here is giving us, like, that's one way to do it. I also love that all of this is kind of in service to Maria, who has had like a child out of wedlock, but who is so clever that she's, able to give everybody some kind of like reassurance, whether or not it is fully, accepted. It doesn't matter because she is in fact coming up with this ingenious thing. So this is writing that I found so compelling. And for many people, that might have been enough. It might be enough just to kind of like really appreciate this kind of virtuoso prose that is astonishing in a 23-year-old. So speaking of the power of language, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that there is a certain meta quality. There's a lot of talk here about fiction. I guess I did not know this. I read this in a review. One of the chapters ends with a line from Joyce's The Dead. So you have, and there's lots of name checking. There's tons about Proust, and we have Joyce mentioned. There's like a bunch of different literary greats are mentioned here, which is an interesting thing because he is, this kind of wunderkind. And clearly this is a book that is very invested in language and in the power of language and like making language new, but of course it's also very old-fashioned. So it's a really potent kind of mix in terms of what he is saying about fiction. If you kind of pull out all of these authors and their influences and just the importance of fiction in general. And then there was a moment, it's on page 81 and 83, where we have this kind of more distinctly meta thing where he kind of our narrator steps out and talks about the process of writing. And I loved that, but I also was like, wait, this is kind of floating here out in the middle of nowhere because we don't have much of it before and we don't have much of it after. So on page 81, we have this incursion of the writer, the author, into the work. So on 81, the writer fears nothing so much as happiness, which is understandable, for writing is conserving, recording, ordering, but happiness avoids language, eludes words, hides in the past, and crumbles when you try to explain it. But as neither Lily nor Lajos was a writer, they lived in their happiness like animals who waste no thought on the future and do not long for explanations. So this to me does feel like something that was written by someone who is older, someone who's had a lot of experience writing. It's just an interesting observation, this idea that happiness is harder to convey. I'm not sure that is true. I'm not sure it's harder to convey, but it's like way less interesting to talk about how somebody is so happy, which is like interesting unto itself. Of course, it's very interesting to talk about someone who's happy like before a fall or someone who has like regained their happiness after tragedy. There are lots of ways that happiness woven into something else is interesting. So in some ways, like I'm not even sure this is true, but I really enjoyed the idea of explicitly talking about the power of language. And I really liked this phrase, for writing is conserving, recording, ordering. But happiness avoids language, eludes words, hides in the past, and crumbles when you try to explain it. I like that whole succession of things that are kind of fighting against each other. I mean, I could spend a long, long time talking about how gorgeous this prose is and how well it's working and the different aspects. But like even here, the thing that was so appealing to me, I was like, what's with the kind of like one-off jumping the writer into the text? So on page 83, this is literally like one page of text later. But the writer also knows that happiness passes and they simply have to wait until it gives way to other feelings. So this is like, I loved that. Not only was the incursion of the writer cool, but then the idea of like continuing that and kind of going back, but the writer knows. I loved that, like the kind of way that it was almost in dialogue with itself. So like very quickly we're moving out of this writer thing. And then unfortunately it never pops back up again. But much is made about like all of the literary kind of aspects of this novel. There are a lot of people writing things in here. There are a lot of letters being written. There is this sense of like what fiction can do and the importance of writing. And also, it's very bold in some ways for Biedermann to be like name checking all of these like gigantic literary people, like these incredibly accomplished like writers. He's not like putting himself in that pantheon, but you do have the sense that the aspirational quality of the prose, by talking about all of these other people, there obviously then influences on what it is he is up to. So I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. I hope that if you loved this novel, I didn't just like ruin it for you. And I did find it very enjoyable for the first half. I mean, I'm just going to say that. I really was engrossed. And then I found myself being like, oh gosh, all right, we got to just like get through. We got to keep moving here. And I enjoyed a lot of the prose, but again, I didn't have that kind of forward propulsion. One thing that came up again and again in every review I read, and I absolutely am agreeing with this, is that this is like, he's like one to watch, you know? I think they have that in People magazine, but we do have here like a very unusual talent. This is someone who has stepped onto the stage in full power of his capacities, or whatever that quotation was. I really do feel like he has extraordinary capabilities, and they are on display in many, many ways. This book is an absolutely incredible achievement. I just felt like in certain ways, it didn't quite live up to the hype, and that a lot of the potential that the text itself created in the beginning just didn't quite endure, and it didn't change enough, and it didn't kind of come to some sort of fruition that made the whole thing feel, for me, just not quite as successful as I would have wanted. But I hope this has been interesting, and I want to thank you for tuning in. It's always so interesting for me to go back and look at something that wasn't quite satisfactory, to really understand what is working, but also the aspects that I just was like, not quite. So thank you so much for listening. Happy reading.